The Galactic Wilderness Preservation Initiative had seemed like such a brilliant idea when the Interstellar Council proposed it 6 cycles ago. Take representatives from 17 member species, drop them on pristine worlds, catalogue the native flora and fauna, establish conservation protocols, and prove that the galaxy's diverse civilizations could cooperate on something that didn't involve trade disputes or territorial pissing contests. In theory, it was diplomatic gold. In practice, it was a bureaucratic fever dream that made tax season on Betelgeuse look straightforward. Planet Verdant 9 was supposed to be the initiative's crowning achievement. Lush forests, breathable atmosphere for 60% of participating species, minimal predator threats, and weather patterns so predictable you could set your chronometer by them. The perfect camping trip for beings who'd evolved past the inconvenience of actual survival skills. Naturally, someone had to screw it up. Commander Zelkith of the Krillian Empire stood in the clearing that served as base camp, his 4 eyes twitching in a pattern that universally translated to "I'm about to have an aneurysm." Around him, 15 species argued in 7 different languages about the same fundamental problem. There were supposed to be 42 portable habitat modules. There were currently 0. "Explain to me again," Zelkith said, his translator struggling to convey the precise flavor of his fury, how an entire shipment of shelters simply vanished. Captain Draxon of the Vrexian Rangers stood at attention, which for his species meant all 6 limbs locked in a pose that screamed military discipline and 0 accountability. "Sir, the Rangers required the habitat modules for establishing a proper defensive perimeter. Standard protocol demands we secure the area before civilians can." "We are the civilians, you phosphorescent moron," shrieked Quelix, the Metherian delegate, her gaseous form roiling inside her containment suit. "This is a conservation expedition. What exactly are you defending us from?" "Aggressive moss." "Procedure is procedure," Draxon replied with the smug certainty of someone who'd never been forced to sleep on actual ground. The human designation Marcus Webb, though most aliens simply called him the Earth One, sat on a fallen log at the edge of the argument, whittling a stick with a knife that technically violated 3 different weapons protocols. He hadn't said a word for the past 20 minutes, which Zelkith had learned was either a very good sign or a very bad one. With humans, it was impossible to tell until something was already on fire. The Zentari representative, a crystalline entity named Prax 7, chimed like an agitated wind chime. "This is illogical. Our species requires precise environmental controls. Without the habitat modules, my cellular structure will begin degrading within 8 hours. Our mucous membranes will desiccate in 4, moaned Gluther the Ploraxian, his slug-like body already looking somewhat deflated. "Perhaps," suggested Yenna, the Quilax diplomat, her feathers ruffling nervously, "we could file a formal complaint with the Expedition Oversight Committee." Zelkith's eyes twitched faster. "The Oversight Committee is 3 systems away. We're here for 14 planetary rotations. By the time they respond, we'll either have solutions or corpses." "Could we not simply share the Rangers' habitat modules?" asked one of the Fenari, his whiskers drooping hopefully. Draxon's mandibles clicked negatively. "Tactical shelters are classified equipment. Civilian access is prohibited under regulation. I'm going to classify your mandibles in a regulation bodily cavity if you finish that sentence," Quelix hissed. The argument continued spiraling, each species contributing their own flavor of panic to the chaos. The hexapods wanted to know if they could requisition emergency transport off-planet. The Luminari were concerned about their photosynthetic cycles being disrupted. One of the Trilaxians suggested they could all huddle together for warmth, which prompted an immediate and horrified rejection from at least 9 species who found physical contact with non-compatible biology, somewhere between uncomfortable and potentially fatal. The humans stood up. Every eye, stalk, sensory organ, and electromagnetic receptor turned toward him. He stretched, an unnecessarily prolonged gesture that humans seemed to use specifically to irritate other species, and tucked his knife away. "Where are you going?" Zelkith demanded. "Gonna build a house," Marcus said, as casually as someone might announce they were going to check their messages. Prax 7's crystalline structure flickered with confusion. "You cannot possibly construct a habitation module without proper tools and materials. The fabrication requirements alone, who said anything about fabricating?" Marcus was already walking toward the tree line, eyes scanning the forest with the focus of someone who actually knew what they were looking for. Back in 20, he disappeared into the woods, leaving behind a clearing full of beings who'd collectively spent 70,000 years evolving past primitive survival, staring at the trees like they'd just swallowed their translator devices. "Should we follow him?" Yenna asked. "Absolutely not," Zelkith said firmly. "Humans do approximately 70% of their most inadvisable activities when they think no one's watching. We give him space and hope he doesn't accidentally befriend an apex predator." 17 minutes later, the human sense of time was infuriatingly accurate. Marcus emerged from the forest carrying an armload of branches, not refined materials, not pre-processed components, actual branches, complete with bark and the occasional confused insect. The clearing fell silent except for the gentle hum of Quelix's containment suit and Gluther's distressed squelching. "What?" Prax 7 chimed slowly. "Are you doing?" "Building a house," Marcus repeated, dropping his load and immediately heading back for more. "Said that already. You folks having translator problems? With sticks?" Yenna's voice climbed an octave. "Well, branches technically, and leaves. Lots of leaves. You got a lot of leaves around here, which is convenient." Over the next 2 hours, the human performed what could only be described as orchestrated madness. He returned to the forest 7 more times, each trip yielding armfuls of branches, bundles of smaller sticks bound with strips of bark, and enough dead leaves to bury a pluraxian, which, given Gluther's increasing dehydration, might soon be necessary anyway. The aliens watched with the horrified fascination of beings witnessing someone solve a quantum equation using finger painting. Marcus selected a spot near 3 close-growing trees, stuck a long, sturdy branch into the ground at an angle, and propped it against the strongest trunk. Then another branch, then another, creating a ribcage-like framework that looked less like architecture and more like the forest's attempt at abstract art. "This is your solution?" Draxon scoffed. "A pile of organic debris." "Not yet," Marcus said cheerfully, weaving smaller branches through the larger framework. "Right now it's just the bones. Gotta add the meat." "I'm going to vomit," Gluther moaned. "And given my species' digestive process, that's a 3-hour commitment." But the human continued with the unshakable confidence of someone who'd done this before, probably multiple times, possibly because his species was too stubborn to evolve past it. He created a lattice structure, each branch interlocking with the next in patterns that seemed random until suddenly they weren't. The framework grew denser, more purposeful, until it resembled a ribbed dome approximately 3 meters long and 2 meters wide at the base. Zelkith found himself moving closer, his scientific curiosity overriding his diplomatic obligations. "You've constructed this type of shelter before." "Built my first one when I was 12, Marcus said, not pausing in his work. "Survival training course. Instructor dropped us in the woods with a knife and a water bottle, told us we had 3 days to not die. Good times. Your species trains children in wilderness survival." Prax 7 sounded genuinely shocked. "Some of us, others learn camping, hiking, orienteering. We've got this weird cultural thing where we teach our kids that nature's trying to kill them, and they should know how to kill it back. or at least negotiate a temporary truce involving fire and shelter. Then came the leaves. Oh, sweet entropy, Prax 7 chimed. He's insulating it. With leaves, Yenna repeated, apparently stuck on this particular outrage. You got something against leaves? Marcus asked, packing handfuls of dead foliage into the gaps between branches. They're waterproof when layered right. They insulate, they're biodegradable, and best of all, they're free. Which is good, because I didn't see any of you volunteering to expense report your way out of this situation. He demonstrated the technique, showing how each layer of leaves overlapped the one below, creating shingles that would shed water away from the structure. See, the secret's in the angle. You want everything pointing down and out. Water's lazy. It takes the path of least resistance. You just make sure that path leads away from where you're sleeping. Fascinating, Zelkith muttered, actually taking notes on his datapad. Biomimetic architecture, using available organic materials. The engineering principles are sound if primitive. Primitive works, Marcus said. Primitive's been working since before your species figured out fire. Hell, before my species figured out fire. And we were late to that party. More aliens drifted over, their arguments about protocols and complaints temporarily forgotten in the face of watching something none of them had ever seen before: construction without technology. The Fennery were particularly entranced, their small size and natural curiosity making them brave enough to ask questions. Why those specific branches? One asked, pointing at the framework. Dead wood's lighter, but you want branches that still have some flex, Marcus explained. Too brittle, and they'll snap. Too green, and they're heavy, and they'll warp. You're looking for that sweet spot where nature's already done the curing for you. And the leaves must be dead as well. Yep, dry leaves are lighter, and they've already shrunk, so they won't change shape on you. Fresh leaves look nice, but they'll wilt and leave gaps. That's how you wake up with a face full of rain and regret. More branches went on top of the leaves. Then more leaves on top of those branches. Layer after layer, each adding thickness and weatherproofing to the structure. Marcus paid particular attention to the angle of overlap, ensuring each layer shed water away from the one beneath it. He left a small opening at one end, door-sized for humans, claustrophobic for anyone larger, and positively spacious for the Fennery. The inside needs bedding, Marcus announced, disappearing into the forest again. This time he returned with armfuls of dry grass and soft moss, which he spread on the ground inside his creation. There, one debris hut, rated for rain, moderate cold, and judgmental aliens. Warranty void if you show up with unrealistic expectations about luxury. The structure crouched against the trees like it had grown there, all organic curves and forest materials, completely at odds with the sleek technological aesthetic of the now absent habitat modules. It looked primitive. It looked crude. It looked absolutely nothing like the climate-controlled, atmosphere-regulated, automated accommodations everyone had been expecting. It also looked oddly sturdy. That, Draxon said flatly, will collapse in the first breeze. Tell you what, Marcus said, settling onto a log with the satisfied air of someone who'd earned a break. We'll see. Zelkith checked his chronometer. We have 6 hours until dark. I suggest everyone else start filing those formal complaints Yenna mentioned, with enthusiasm. The sun descended over Verdant 9 with the lazy confidence of a celestial body that had done this countless times before and would continue doing so regardless of the drama unfolding beneath it. The clearing filled with the soft glow of portable illumination units as 17 species attempted to make themselves comfortable in a situation they were spectacularly unqualified for. Marcus had started a small fire using methods that made the watching aliens deeply uncomfortable, something about friction and patience and wood that apparently just decided to ignite if you annoyed it sufficiently. He sat beside it, cooking something that smelled surprisingly edible, despite originating from a ration pack that predated most of the expedition members. "Human," Zelkith said, approaching the fire with the careful dignity of someone whose day had gone catastrophically wrong. "I find myself curious. Your species achieved spaceflight, developed faster than light travel, established colonies on hostile worlds. Why maintain these primitive skills?" Marcus prodded his cooking fire with a stick. "Because spaceships break, colonies fail, technology's great until it isn't, and then you're standing in the rain, wishing you'd paid attention during the boring survival lectures. We keep the old skills because forgetting them would be stupid, and humans are only stupid about 70% of the time." 70% seems generous, Quelix muttered from where she'd positioned her containment suit near the fire's warmth. "I round up for optimism," Marcus said cheerfully. "Besides, there's something satisfying about knowing you can handle yourself with nothing but a knife and bad attitude. Makes you less dependent on things that need charging." Then the weather prediction algorithms failed. The rain started at local midnight. Not the gentle precipitation the forecast had promised, but a torrential assault that turned the sky into a solid wall of water. Within minutes, the clearing transformed into a mud pit that sucked at boots, pseudopods, and various alien locomotive appendages with equal enthusiasm. And then the habitat modules began failing. Turns out, when Vrexian Rangers conduct an extensive sensor sweep to establish a defensive perimeter, they pump enough electromagnetic radiation into the surrounding area to scramble any unshielded electronics within a kilometer radius. The habitat modules, being state-of-the-art technological marvels, were absolutely dependent on their electronic environmental controls, which were now displaying error messages in 17 different languages, none of them helpful. The screaming started in at least 8 of those languages simultaneously. Control panels sparked and died. Climate regulators spun wildly through random settings, creating microclimates that ranged from Arctic freeze to tropical sauna within seconds. One habitat module began venting atmosphere, another started filling with what smelled suspiciously like sulfur dioxide, and a third simply gave up and collapsed into a sad pile of expensive composite materials. Zelkith stumbled through the rain toward the one structure that wasn't lit by the frantic glow of malfunctioning technology. The debris hut sat dark and silent against its trees, water streaming down its layered sides and dripping harmlessly away from the entrance. He ducked inside, his translator catching the tail end of what the human was saying. "And that's why you always pack the leaves in the same direction as the rainfall, unless you're in a region with prevailing crosswinds, in which case you adjust your angle and add extra layers on the windward side. It's not complicated, it's just pattern recognition, and oh hey Commander, come on in, there's room." The interior was dry. Not mostly dry, not damp but tolerable, completely impossibly dry, and warm, heated by the simple fact that organic materials decomposed slightly, insulated well, and kept the rain out better than technology that cost more than most planetary GDPs. 3 Fenari were already curled in one corner, their fur dry and fluffed. Prax 7 had wedged himself near the back, his crystalline structure no longer flickering with dehydration stress. Gluther occupied a carefully moistened patch of moss, looking less like a dying slug and more like a smug slug who'd made excellent real estate decisions. "How," Zelkith said carefully, water dripping from every surface of his body, "is this working?" Marcus shrugged, barely visible in the darkness. "Physics, geometry. A couple thousand years of human trial and error. Also, I didn't pack the thing with technology that could be scrambled by a bunch of paranoid rangers playing with sensors they don't understand. A particularly violent gust of wind shook the trees outside. The debris hut didn't even creak. The leaves compressed slightly, the branches flexed, and the entire structure absorbed the impact like it had been expecting it all along. Your species builds permanent structures this way? Prac 7 asked. Used to. Some still do, for tradition or practice. Mostly we use it for emergency situations, survival scenarios, or when we're showing off to aliens who think they're too advanced to learn from primitive techniques. Marcus grinned in the darkness. How's that working out for everyone tonight? Outside, the sounds of technological civilization collapsing continued unabated. Zelkith could hear Draxon shouting orders that no one was following, Quelix's containment suit alarm screaming about humidity levels, and what sounded like Yenna attempting to nest under an equipment tarp that was doing absolutely nothing to keep her dry. The hexapods were clicking in distress. The luminary had gone completely dark, conserving energy. Someone's translator was malfunctioning, producing a stream of what sounded like ancient Krillian poetry mixed with cooking instructions. How many can this shelter? Zelkith asked. Built it for me. But humans are used to sharing space when survival's on the line. We can probably fit 8, maybe 10 if people don't mind getting cozy. Though fair warning, close quarters with multiple species gets interesting when everyone's wet and stressed. Over the next hour, the debris hut's population grew to include 2 more Fenari, a very apologetic Quilix, who kept accidentally molting wet feathers, one of the Pluraxians, and 3 beings from species whose names Zelkith couldn't pronounce but who looked significantly happier inside than they had outside. The Rangers huddled in their malfunctioning tactical shelters, too proud to admit they needed help from a primitive structure built by a primitive species using primitive materials. Marcus sat near the entrance, occasionally adding more material to spots where drips formed, maintaining his creation with the casual competence of someone who understood that survival wasn't about having the best equipment, it was about having any equipment that actually worked. You know what's funny? Marcus said to no one in particular, his voice carrying in the darkness. Every species in this galaxy can terraform planets. You can reshape atmospheres, redirect asteroids, build stations that house billions. But put you in a forest with some rain, and you're helpless without your gadgets. We evolved past such necessities, Prac 7 chimed quietly. Did you though? Or did you just outsource survival to technology and forget that the universe doesn't care about your engineering degrees when the chips are down? Nature doesn't negotiate. It doesn't accept excuses. It just is, and you either adapt or you get wet and miserable. One of the Fenari chittered thoughtfully. Your species maintains connection to these older skills. This seems inefficient from an evolutionary perspective. Maybe, or maybe it's the smartest thing we ever did. Technology fails. Always has. Always will. But knowing how to find water, build shelter, make fire, that's permanent. That's knowledge that works whether you're on Earth or Verdant 9 or some unnamed rock at the edge of the galaxy. It's universal because it's based on universal principles. Zelkith found himself unable to argue. Outside, the most advanced species in the galaxy were learning an expensive lesson about self-reliance. Inside, they were learning that sometimes the oldest solutions were the best solutions, and that there was no shame in admitting that beings who built spaceships could still learn from beings who built huts from sticks and leaves. The rain continued for 3 more hours, then tapered off to a drizzle, then finally stopped. The clouds cleared slowly, revealing a sky full of stars that looked down on the clearing with the indifferent sparkle of distant suns who'd seen this all before. Dawn arrived with the apologetic brightness of a star that hadn't meant to cause all this trouble. The rain had stopped 3 hours earlier, leaving behind a clearing that looked like a disaster relief zone. Habitat modules lay scattered and sparking, their sleek exteriors muddy and cracked. Equipment that had cost enough to fund small colonies sat ruined in puddles. The Rangers' tactical shelters had collapsed entirely, leaving Draxon and his team looking like drowned military equipment catalogs with regrets. The debris hut stood exactly as it had been, only slightly more leaf-covered than before, still dry, still functional, still smugly organic. Marcus emerged first, stretching in that infuriating human way, surveying the destruction with an expression that screamed, "I told you so," without saying a word. He walked the perimeter of his structure, checking for damage, finding none, nodding with satisfaction. Zelkith crawled out after him, his uniform ruined but his dignity marginally intact, thanks to the human's primitive genius. Around the clearing, bedraggled aliens were attempting to salvage equipment, file reports, and maintain what little dignity remained after being defeated by precipitation. "I suppose," Zelkith said carefully, "the Galactic Wilderness Preservation Initiative will need to update its equipment protocols. Might want to update your training protocols too," Marcus suggested, already gathering materials for what looked like the beginning of a second shelter. "You know, teach people how to not die when their batteries run out." Just a thought. By mid-morning, 4 more debris huts had appeared in the clearing, each one built under Marcus's sarcastic tutelage. The human turned out to be a surprisingly patient teacher when people were actually willing to learn instead of arguing about regulations and protocols. The Fenari took to it immediately, their small size and natural nesting instincts making them surprisingly good students. They built a communal hut that looked like a beaver lodge had married a bird's nest, and somehow it worked perfectly for their needs. The Quillex learned quickly that feathers and construction were incompatible, but they could gather materials like champions. Yenna organized supply runs with military efficiency, directing groups to collect specific types of branches, particular grades of leaves, optimal bedding materials. Even Prax 7 participated, using his crystalline structure to precisely measure angles and ensure weatherproofing. His mathematical approach to debris hut construction resulted in a shelter that looked like it had been designed by a very artistic geometry professor, all perfect angles and calculated leaf placement. The Pluraxians struggled initially, manipulating branches with pseudopods required techniques Marcus had to improvise, but once they figured out they could create moisture barriers using specific moss types, they built structures that doubled as humidity chambers. Gluther's hut looked like a small green hill and apparently felt like a luxury spa from the inside. The Rangers did not participate. They sat in their ruined tactical perimeter, filling out forms about equipment failure and pretending they couldn't hear the sound of aliens who'd never touched wilderness building homes from scratch. Draxon approached the original debris hut at hour 8, his 6 limbs radiating the defeated posture of someone about to eat crow, or whatever the Vrexian equivalent was, probably something phosphorescent and deeply shameful. "The human," he said stiffly, not making eye contact with Marcus, "would you be willing to provide instruction in primitive shelter construction?" Marcus looked up from where he was teaching a Pluraxian the finer points of leaf layering. "You mean the thing you called organic debris yesterday? I may have been premature in my assessment." "Aha. And those tactical shelters working out for you?" Draxon's mandibles clicked in what the translator interpreted as a sigh. "No, tell you what," Marcus said, standing and dusting off his hands, "I'll teach you. But first you're gonna apologize to every single being in this clearing for taking their shelters to play security theater. Then you're gonna help me build 3 more huts, because we're still short. Then, and only then, will I teach you how to not die in the woods like a competent sapient being. Deal. The Vrexian Ranger, elite military operative, veteran of 3 campaigns, and holder of 4 distinguished service medals, looked at the primitive human with his primitive knowledge and his primitive shelters that had survived what advanced technology could not. Deal, Draxon said quietly. The apology tour was spectacular. Draxon, to his credit, delivered each one with genuine remorse, though his translator seemed to struggle with conveying the appropriate level of shame in some languages. Quillix accepted hers with a cutting remark about competence. The Fenari chittered forgiveness immediately. Prax 7 simply chimed acknowledgement, already too absorbed in optimizing hut construction angles. Then came the building. Marcus worked Draxon and his rangers hard, making them haul branches, gather leaves, and learn through repetition and sore limbs why humans respected manual labor. The rangers discovered muscles they didn't know they had, and developed newfound appreciation for construction techniques that didn't involve fabrication units. By day 3, the clearing had transformed. 16 debris huts clustered in natural groupings, each one reflecting its builder's species and needs. Some were larger, some smaller, some focused on weatherproofing, others on ventilation. The Luminari built theirs with gaps that allowed sunlight penetration for their photosynthesis. The hexapods created a networked structure that connected 3 separate huts through covered walkways made from woven branches. The original habitat modules had been cannibalized for parts, their expensive components repurposed into things that actually worked. Zelkith authorized it personally, figuring the bean counters back at headquarters could argue about property damage after everyone survived the expedition. By the time the expedition's shuttle returned on day 14 to collect everyone, the clearing looked less like a scientific base camp and more like a forest village that had achieved consciousness and decided to get organized. Debris huts clustered between the trees, each one unique to its builder's species but all sharing the same fundamental design principles. Work with nature, not against it, and remember that simplicity often beats complexity when survival's on the line. Zelkith stood next to Marcus as the shuttle descended, watching beings from 17 species pack up shelters they'd built with their own appendages, manipulators, and occasionally telekinetic fields. There was something different about them now, a confidence that came from knowing they could handle themselves without technology babysitting their every move. You know what the really funny part is, Marcus said, not looking at the commander. We knew this stuff before we had spacecraft, before we had cities, before we probably had language, and we never forgot it, because humans have this weird habit of assuming everything's eventually going to break, and we'll need to start over from scratch. Is that pessimism or pragmatism? Zelkith asked. Yes, Marcus said, grinning. Both, simultaneously. It's a human thing. We prepare for the worst while hoping for the best, and we never throw away knowledge just because it seems outdated. You never know when knowing how to make fire or build shelter or find clean water might be the thing that saves your life. A philosophy worth considering, Zelkith admitted. The shuttle's loading ramp extended. Beings filed aboard, many of them carrying small bundles of branches or carefully preserved leaf samples, souvenirs from their wilderness education, physical reminders that the gap between advanced civilization and primitive survival was smaller than most species wanted to admit. The after-action report filed by Commander Zelkith would eventually become required reading at every Galactic Wilderness Preservation Initiative training facility. It contained detailed instructions for debris hut construction, numerous diagrams, and one particularly pointed paragraph about how any species that couldn't survive 3 days without electronic assistance probably shouldn't be calling themselves advanced civilizations. The report's final line, which Zelkith suspected the human had dictated, became something of a motto among conservation teams. Technology fails, rangers make mistakes. Weather changes, leaves however remain remarkably consistent. Somewhere in the galaxy, on a planet whose name was filed in 17 different linguistic databases, a cluster of debris huts slowly decomposed back into the forest floor. They'd served their purpose, housed beings from across the stars, and proved that sometimes the best solution to a problem was the one that had been working since before problems had proper names or species had spaceships to escape them. The Rangers never took all the tents again. They'd learned their lesson about protocols versus practicality, about security theater versus actual preparedness. Future expeditions included mandatory wilderness training. Every participant learned basic shelter construction before they were allowed off-planet. The debris hut became an official backup protocol, documented and standardized and taught across a dozen species. The humans kept building them anyway, even when tents were available, just in case. Because humans never quite trusted that things would work as planned, and they'd been proven right often enough that nobody argued anymore. Marcus Webb returned to Earth after the expedition, added interstellar wilderness instructor to his resume, and occasionally received messages from alien species asking advice about leaf angles or branch selection. He answered everyone, usually with the same mix of practical information and gentle mockery that had characterized his teaching on Verdant 9. And somewhere in the vast archives of galactic knowledge, between treatises on quantum mechanics and guides to terraforming, sat a simple document titled Debris Hut Construction, a primitive solution to universal problems. It had been downloaded 3 million times and counting. Progress, it turned out, sometimes meant remembering what you'd learned before you got clever.